welcome back. We are covering in this section Chapter 5, the understanding of transgender history. It's kind of the evolution of transgender science, more than culture or other things, but touches a little bit on everything. This is taken from Transgender Ideology and Gender Dysphoria, A Catholic Response, the book. This is a commentary to go along with it. I'm probably going to turn Chapter 5 into 3 sections. They could do 6 sections, which I think would be too broken down, and 1 section would probably be too long. So I'm going to probably do this in 3 sections. So we start kind of chronologically with earlier history versus we'll progress on. So in the early form, right, when we consider the early life, right, of human life, of history, where was transgender people? Where was intersex people, right? People with atypical sexuality. Where did they fit into the story? Now, we did touch on this a bit in Chapter 3 with going over gender variance and, people in India, people in Iran, Thailand. So I'm not going to recover that. If you are interested in that, go back to Chapter 3 and look up gender variance. At the same time, don't message and say, well, you left out the India. Well, I covered it already. But the history that we're looking at here is more the science. In general, here's a general thing about history altogether, is for most people, for most of history, people were so poor and living hand to mouth that the average person wasn't all that involved in a lot of ideology or when it comes to sexuality and sex in particular. People are just too busy to get into it, right? A lot of our history that we have, a lot of what we think of when we think of the past is often that which was written or composed or artistically composed by people who were affluent, right? We know probably more about the life in the courts of Louis XVI than we do of the everyday people at the time, right? We know about the courts of the kings and the queens, but we don't know as much about the everyday life of the everyday people. So sometimes in history we can look at things and think, well, this was a decadent time. Well, it wasn't decadent for everyone. It was decadent for, the aristocracy. It was kind of miserable for everybody else. And the most of human history, people, again, were living hand to mouth. People who were marrying. Why wasn't there a sexual revolution earlier in history? Well, this whole democratic process and the self-expression and I got to be myself, these are very modern ideas, right? People didn't have time for this. And basically, there was too much work to do, right? People, at the end of the day of working, from the time the sun went up to the time the sun went down and your belly was still empty, you probably didn't have a lot of time to say, what, I really feel more like a woman. You just didn't have the energy or the time. The average person wouldn't have had that type of, even when it comes to, marrying for love, right? Even talking about marrying for love. More or less, right? This kind of view of that you should be married to your soulmate and all this. This is very bourgeois and modern, right? People often married out of convenience, out of practicality. She's a good woman, she's a faithful woman, she's healthy, she can bear children that can help on the farm. Good enough, right? Sexual attraction, is she pretty enough? Do we have great chemistry? Right? This is not the primary concern of people until the industrial revolutions, the farming revolutions, where people have more luxury when it comes to time and money, and say, well, what do I want, right? This idea of what do I want. Before the last 200 years, I'm not sure many people had the luxury of saying, what do I want? It was, how do I survive, right? How do I make it through this winter? How do I, I just lost a child. I lost a family member. I lost my friends, you're on your third wife who died during childbearing. You just didn't have a lot of time for all of this talk. So not to say transgender or intersex or other types of asexual variations didn't exist in the past. It just wasn't a very big part of the past because people just didn't have the time to worry about it. No, but there has always been this kind of bourgeois element that has existed, right? You've always had the courts and the philosophers and the people who have had the time to create the mythologies. And, presumably they wrote a bit about what they saw, and they saw everyday people, so they probably incorporated that in it. It's just the perspective will not be from ordinary people, it'll be from elite people. The early science, early understanding of intersex or transgender would have been hermaphroditism, right? We don't use that term anymore, but hermaphrodite comes from Hermes, the god Hermes, and Aphrodite, right? They fell in love, they had a child, and their child was both male and female. So it was hermaphrodite, taking from the two names of the parents. This is also then seen in Plato. If you look to the Symposium, you can see Aristophanes gives the great dialogue about, in the beginning, you had people who were round with four sets of legs, 4 arms, 2 heads, and they were back to back. And you had male, male, and female, female, and male, female. And they tried to conquer the heavens, and Zeus cut them in half. And now they're looking for their other half, right? So the males are looking for males, and they would be homosexual. Females are trying to find each other, lesbians, and male females cut in half, heterosexuality, right? So there were 3 sexes in the beginning with the Greek stories. If you recall back to the Christian narrative, you have just Adam, right? Just one sex. So the Greeks, they started with 3 sexes. With the Judeo-Christian tradition, 1 sex, Adam, and has the rib removed, and it's made Eve. And kind of the same story. They look for their other half again, right? Their missing piece makes them whole, right? So in some ways, it's like the Greek myth, the Christian myth, but it's different, right? You're starting with 1 sex compared to 3 sexes. But with this is this, kind of built into the Greek is some idea of, people are born with 2 sexes or 3 sexes, right? It's a different starting point. And androgyny from this Greek term is male and female, right? Both, right? So if you saw somebody who was born with both sets of genitalia, right, ovotestes or true hermaphroditism, you would say they were an androgen, right? Androgen. So they kind of have this within their mythology already. Now, Hippocrates, ancient Greek, he has this other idea of this 3rd sex, or this other way of being, and it's that the womb determined the sex of the person. So it's the heat or the coldness. So if the woman was very hot when she conceived, the child would form into a male. If the womb was very cold, it would form into a female. So temperature determined the sex. We know this is not true today because at the moment of conception, you're either XX or XY, and heat has very little to do after that, right? It doesn't have much to do with that. But this idea of the heat had a long-standing understanding within the Western tradition. So Galenus in the first centuries of AD was a Greek physician. He continued Aristotle's perspective, the Hippocrates perspective, in that one part of the uterus was hot and one part was cold. So then it depended on where the sperm went. Did it go to the hot side, the cold side? And it could be somewhere in between, right? It could be somewhere in between. So if you were right in the middle, you were both male and female, right? So in some ways, this is early sex as a spectrum ideology. And the surgeon for the kings of France was it Henry II, Francis II, Charles IV, Ninth, and Henry III. So he was the surgeon for 4 kings. So not bad. He did pretty well, living 80 years old. Ambrose Paré, he said that intersex is created when a girl is jumping too much. She gets too heated, and the organs go external. Right? So it kind of creates it's again heat. Heat creates, So you got to keep women cool, right? Because if women get too hot, they could start forming male genitalia even after they're born. We could say, well, these are just silly myths, but to give them credit in the people like Hippocrates and Aristotle who came up with this caloric theory, alligators do have, reptiles often their sex is determined by the heat of the eggs, right? The eggs at a certain temperature might be more male or more female based on the heat of the eggs. So heat does seem to have an effect. It just doesn't have as much of an effect on humans, right? Although you might still have people say, the woman's temperature might determine if it'll be a boy or girl. This is more, again, kind of like an old wives' tale today. But this would have been the best science even up and through the 16th century. This all changes with the discovery of genetics. Genetics changes this perspective. Jumping into kind of modern science of understanding of kind of intersex and hermaphroditism and perhaps I keep saying transgender in here, but that's because transgender in here could be, if your claim is that a person has an intersexed brain, right, and this is what the Muslims in Iran claim, right? This is then transgender fits within this intersex. Although it seems we don't have many testimonies of people who claim to be truly transgender in the West. It's just not. It doesn't. Maybe they were too busy, right? They're too busy working and they're too tired to talk about it, and you might have been burned at the stake for saying it, so you're just not going to, it's not recorded. Perhaps that's part of it. Again, Magnus Hirschfeld is kind of builds on this idea, the ideas of Richard von Krafft-Ebing in the 1860s, the Germans, and the first book kind of written on the topic of this is Psychopathia Sexualis, right? Now this is starting to move from intersex to transgender, right? So Psychopathia Sexualis, so the psychology, the psychopathy of sex. And he used the term psychic transsexual, right? So the psychic transsexual, right? We're talking about gender, right? Because psychic is the way one thinks. So the thinking of transsexualism is what we would call transgender today. So that's written in 1910. Unfortunately, we don't have a copy of where this actually is. This is all secondary sources that say that he claimed this in 1910 because being Hirschfeld was Jewish, and he existed during Nazi Germany, and all of his books were destroyed. We don't have much of his studies, unfortunately. The 19th century studies kind of destroyed by the Nazis. So luckily, Magnus is not destroyed by the Nazis. He escapes, but his work does. But you start seeing the first writings in the West, anyway, of transsexualism or transgenderism. 1910, a little bit before, with von Krafft-Ebing in the 19th century. People like Ralph Werther, who would publish under the pseudonym Earl Lind, in 1918 wrote an autobiography of an androgen, right? Andro meaning male and gen meaning female, right? So transgender is the term that we would use today. He describes a club of transgender people, the Circle Hermaphrodites. They met at the Parisius Hall, which is a gay brothel in New York City that opened in the 1890s. And Lind is writing about that. So there is a developing community even in the late 19th century for kind of this alternative way, right? This could be homosexuality, it could be transgender, it could be transvestitism, it could be drag, right? It can be a lot of things that kind of are included in this kind of space, right? You can think of something like Berlin, right? Berlin had that scene going on around that time as well, right? Cabaret, watch Cabaret. In 1930s, the Sexology magazine starts getting letters from people asking about surgeries and what should they do, right? So you can clearly see there's a bit more of an opening here. People are starting to talk about it more in the 1930s. We just got out of the roaring 20s where there's kind of openness. And the advice of Sexology magazine is that there's nothing we can do about it, right? There's no known science that can do anything. If you feel like typically we're men who felt like women. If you're a man and you feel like you're a woman, there's nothing you can really do. You can try to align your mind to your body, but there's nothing that can be done. The medical technology improves a lot after World War II. So if you think about what's going on in the 19th century, well, we've discovered antibiotics. Well, that changes a lot when it comes to surgery, right? You would never want to operate on somebody without antibiotics. So in the past, before antibiotics, it would have been very dangerous to perform any type of surgery unless it was absolutely necessary. Now, with antibiotics, you can have surgery and survive, right? So antibiotics is a big deal. Anesthesia is a big deal. That's a good modern invention. And a big thing is we've had 2 world wars, and people have come back maimed from war, right? World War I and World War II. And, people are disfigured. And now we are doing surgeries and stuff to help veterans, live with it, right? You've had a leg blown off. We've had prosthetics. We have things to cover, to try to help with pain, right? So we have, in the wake of World War II, an advance of surgery, right? We've had a lot of surgery. And some of it cosmetic, right? If you blew up a piece of your body, some of it would be trying to bring the person to look like they did before, right? So some of it is cosmetic as well. So this is a big thing of the 19th century. But the technology now exists, right? This technology exists that didn't exist before. In 1949, right, this is after World War II, David Cadwell, he wrote Psychopathia Transsexualis. They always loved writing in Latin, at least the titles. They used the term transsexualism for the first time in 1949 to identify people who wanted a sex change, right? So this is now the breaking into a new era, right? And the last piece of this new technology is the age of Harry Benjamin, right? So Harry Benjamin is a German who flees to the United States. There's a trend of Germans fleeing to the United States during the 20th century. Gee, I wonder why. And he starts studying glands, right? Testes, ovaries, hormones, right? Hormones are something that is actually a very new field of study. We think of it seems so strange that for the whole human history we really didn't know anything or very much at all about hormones, and now in the mid 20th century all of a sudden they discover hormones and that it might have an effect. So Harry Benjamin is studying this new field of hormones, endocrinology, and he's trying to do interesting things like add male gonads into female mice and see if it turns them more male, and the effects of testosterone on female or estrogen on males, all within rodents, not people. But part of the idea is that they could eventually, they notice that as we get older as humans, our hormone levels decrease, and that's when we start looking and acting old, right? This is kind of know this. So maybe they could replace the hormone replacement. And if we do hormone replacement, maybe you could stay younger looking longer, right? What's the difference between somebody who's 20 and somebody who's 70? A lot of it is hormones, right? Hormone levels. So this was something he pushed, was working on. Turns out that's not such a good idea, right? People still sometimes do this, but we have learned that artificial levels of hormones can lead to cancer and other things, right? Ideally, it would be nice. You just take this testosterone and you stay 20, 30 years old until you're 90, right? That was the dream. It doesn't really work that way. Having to follow nature is a terrible inconvenience, but it's kind of how it works. So Dr. Benjamin is working on hormones, and it turns out that he ends up in the same hotel with Alfred Kinsey. Now, you may have heard of Alfred Kinsey before, right? He is a sexologist, and he's trying to figure out all types of things about human sexuality. He's doing all these interviewing people to try to find out what people think, what people say, because people haven't really studied this a lot, right? We didn't talk about it. Kinsey is talking about it, and he's trying to figure out what are people thinking about, what are their sexualities, what's their fantasy life like, what is their sex life like, right? This is all Kinsey's interest. And he comes across a person named Van, who's 23 years old, and he's a male who claims to be a female and had received accommodations at the younger age of acting like a female, but as he's gotten older and puberty has set in, people have stopped accommodating Van, who wants to be identified as a female but is physically a male. So Kinsey asks Benjamin, I know you're working on these hormone things, hormone replacements. What do you think? Do you think there's anything that could be done for someone like Van? Could you just add ovaries and the person will be a female, right? Like what you do with mice. And Benjamin, Dr. Benjamin, decides, well, I'll talk to the person, right? I'm curious. So the laws at the time, though, don't really allow for this. This was called mayhem, right? Mayhem laws to meddle with this stuff, right? To try to change a person's sex, kind of a Frankenstein type of move, Dr. Frankenstein type of thing, playing around with human beings like that. So they weren't in favor of it. So Van goes, gets the surgery outside of the United States, comes back, lives a quiet life in Canada as a female. All right. But Dr. Benjamin also finds out about this married couple, this very unusual married couple, where they both switch sexes. So the husband becomes the wife and the wife becomes the husband. And they live opposite sex roles, and but once I think one of them gets a sex change and legally changes their sex, which was allowed at the time, that they could legally change your sex, then they were a homosexual couple, and they weren't legally married at that point, but they still stayed together for the rest of their lives, living in the opposite role. Unusual case. But again, Dr. Harry Benjamin is an endocrinologist, not a surgeon, so he wasn't involved in the surgical aspect, but he was curious about the hormonal aspect, right? Could hormone replacements change a person's sex? Then the first sex change in America was done by Elmer Belt, UCLA Medical Center, and they did it very quietly, and it was a male to female individual. It was this case here. So 1949, I guess that would be, right, the first sex change in the United States. But it was done very quietly, right? In some ways, there was more accommodations back then because it was so rare. It wasn't seen as an ideological thing. It's like, well, we don't really understand it, but I guess if you're a man now, you're a man, right? They didn't really have a policy, so if you just got somebody to do your paperwork, you can perhaps get it done. It was so unusual at the time. Although you typically see in these cases, it's mostly male to female. You don't see very much a female to male, but there are cases, right? There are notable cases. More often than not, in the female to male cases, it's just women who put on men's clothing and they kind of presented themselves as men, and it's kind of harder for men to go to women, right? You could be a slightly more feminine looking man and still be a man, right? But a man, when you got a beard or you got facial hair and you don't have any breasts and you have masculine features, it's more difficult to be a woman, right? It's perhaps more difficult. This really takes the spotlight then in 1952 when a former GI, military man named Jorgensen, he decides, he's felt like a woman his whole life. He wants to be a woman. He meets Dr. Benjamin. Again, not really much you can do. These mayhem laws in different states and stuff, it's just very difficult. But he goes, and Dr. Benjamin helps with the hormones. He then goes to Sweden to go and get the surgery done. Comes back. His doctor's name was Christine, so he took the name Christine. Christine Jorgensen becomes perhaps one of the most notable transsexuals of the 20th century. Performed in nightclubs and kind of these shows. He had a very long-running show. Kind of became a spectacle, though, right? Because he came across as a very attractive woman. The newspaper headlines called him a blonde bombshell, right? It's a blonde beauty. All the hair and the makeup and everything. A fairly attractive woman, at least in pictures. But it becomes such a spectacle, right? It almost becomes like a sideshow of a circus more than kind of just fitting in and moving into society. Didn't like Van in the earlier case. Van, she just wanted to be a housewife, right? Had the surgery, came back to Canada and disappeared. Lived a quiet life. Christine was in the spotlight. Christine was kind of a big deal. But it kind of put it more on the map. By 1965, Dr. Benjamin had 307 patients, and he had written the book Transsexual Phenomenon, 1966. And now the floodgates kind of opened up, right? Now he's getting thousands of letters and people, and anybody who had a curiosity about it wants to know more. They're kind of flooding in. The letter, but these weren't always successful, right? So one of these stories from this time period, somebody did have the surgery. Again, you would imagine these are very primitive surgeries, right? This is very early surgeries. You wouldn't say this probably about today's surgeries, but somebody who had the surgeries done, patient of Dr. Benjamin's. Not that he was the surgeon, he was the endocrinologist, but said, my male sexual organs are gone. I don't know why that's a surprise. Doctor, they left the name out, performed it in cold blood on me, and one of those horrible mutilations. My so-called vagina entrance looks like a ring of empty scrotum. I have to live, if I have the courage, with this monstrosity. Right. So this is early sex surgeries were not particularly convincing or successful. Right. But there was still a demand. Right. There was still some type of demand for it. So now we're in 1969. 1969 also we have the Stonewall Inn riots. LGBT movement starts taking action, right? They're not going to just be arrested and persecuted. They're going to fight back, right? This becomes part of it. One of the people who was at the Stonewall Inn, kind of late to the show, but she came later on when she heard the commotion. People like Marsha Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, they start this Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, STAR, to help homeless and young drag queens and queers and gay and youth and trans women, to try to organize them. So now we're seeing the beginning of the organizing of the whole LGBT spectrum, right? Kind of how, in the earlier sections, say, well, why is T even in with the LGB? It's not an orientation. Well, it kind of came about organically through politics, right? Outcasts kind of gathered together and they organized themselves together, right? That's how it kind of came about historically. Doesn't make a lot of sense philosophically, but from a historical perspective, it makes sense. So, you also have at this time people like Virginia Prince a little bit later on, who is a transgender person, who is a patient of Dr. Benjamin's, who starts asking questions. It starts getting a bit more philosophical now, right? Now that it's questioning, it's had some medical backing, it's now had political motivation, and now there's enough space for there to be kind of a philosophical questioning, right? People like Van earlier on, right? She was just trying to survive, right? There wasn't really a philosophical element of it. But people like Virginia Prince is seeing this movement and is a member of this movement, and she says that she thinks that for 90% of people that are looking for the surgery, they shouldn't get it. It's the wrong option. She says sexual assignment surgery is a communicable disease, attracting the interest of transvestites seduced by the publicity and the hope that the surgery would improve their lives. Right? If you look at people like Christine Jorgensen, right? She had the surgery and then is in the spotlight. It's kind of like the Caitlyn Jenner situation, right? If you were unsure of your orientation, of sexuality, of identity, and then you look at someone like Caitlyn Jenner, you can go, well, that looks fun, right? Or maybe that's it. That's it. Well, Caitlyn Jenner is also extremely rich and in the spotlight, and no matter what she says or does, she ends up on the front page of a newspaper, right? It can be enticing if you're looking for validation from the outside. You're not going to get it like Caitlyn Jenner. Same way some of these people at the same time, Virginia Prince is writing, you're not going to necessarily become the next Christine Jorgensen, right? You're going to have the same job, the same apartment, you're going to have the same life, right? It might even get harder, right? You might lose your job, you might lose friends, you might lose family, right? To think that doing this change is all of a sudden going to fix everything is probably not for 90% of the people, is what Virginia Prince found even in the 1970s, right? 1978. Virginia advocated on the belief that one's gender can change by merely changing one's role within society. Thus, no sex change is necessary, since a person's sex does not constitute the problem. Right, so you're starting to see the breakdown of the gender versus sex. Right, sex and gender is separating here. Talking about psychological sex versus biological sex. Right, if you're just saying I'm transgender, I feel like a woman, well, live like a woman. Right, is what she's saying. Your body isn't the problem. Your body is your body. But I think it's fair enough to say that Virginia can be a bit hypocritical here as well, since she says, oh, you don't need this stuff. But then she has surgeries and hormones and all this stuff too to feminize her look. So here she is kind of criticizing it, but she's doing it too. I don't think a lot of people were very favorable of Virginia Prince from the trans community. And people probably who are very disgusted with transgender stuff probably didn't like her much either. She was probably unpopular on both sides, people like Virginia Prince. Dr. Benjamin comes up with this Benjamin scale. As you know, the Kinsey scale, you probably heard the Kinsey scale, of completely straight on one side, completely gay on the other side, and everyone's kind of somewhere in between, right, the Kinsey scale. Benjamin scale is something similar, right, but for transgender. So there's some people who are just, they like to put on women's clothing sometime, right? And they're mostly dealing with men here, so it's using the male to female as an example because that's what they were really studying. So there was some people who just put on women's clothing sometime. Well, would the person be eligible for surgery and hormone replacement? No, not if you just put on women's clothing sometimes. That doesn't mean you should have surgery. Then there's the next step, like fetishistic, right? You're doing it, but there's a sexual part of it, like kind of truly transvestite, right? There's a transvestite, right? Probably not, right? If this is just kind of a sexual interest, you don't change your body because of a sexual interest. True transvestites, people who just enjoy putting on women's clothing, appearing women like females, but they fully identify as men, right? So you're truly a man, right? You know that you're a man, but you enjoy the excitement of a women's clothing and women's apparel, right? Again, not appropriate for surgery. And then there's other people who are attracted to it, but it's not strong enough, right? It's not strong. There's people with moderate intensity, and there's people with high intensity transsexual, right? So Dr. Benjamin would consider only people kind of in this higher range, right? People who are in a group 3 would be qualifying for surgeries or any type of medicalized treatment to realign as a female, right? So even within the earliest forms, there has to be a judgment, right? You have to judge the situation. I think there's could be a lesson in here, right? Even the earliest and the most strongest advocates of transgender people still say you don't just take a person's word for it. Don't just say, oh, I feel like I'm a woman, therefore I must have all this surgery. Well, not necessarily, right? You might feel that way. Okay. Well, how strong is it, right? How important is it, right? You can still, you still have to evaluate it. Now, this Benjamin scale is no longer used since we now have the DSM. So the DSM has replaced it, and it is now, we use the term gender dysphoria, and we have a different set of criteria for gender dysphoria. Although within all of these things, they're not without their politics. Politics is still affecting it. So we have right now the DSM, we have criteria. Well, people are constantly trying to change it, right? It's constantly trying to be changed. It's not always being changed because that's what the medical science has determined, but because that's what people want, right? There's an activist element of all of this. Anything that's going to deal with sex and sexuality is going to have combating ideologies, right? That's just part of it. The Age of Dr. Harry Benjamin. I think I'll stop here, and I'll pick this one up in the next part 2. Right, we'll do a part 2.